Son.
Hola. Hola. Escucha mejor que no se escucha nada en realidad, ¿no? Hola. Me mintieron acá. Hola. Ah. Sí, ahí. Bueno.
¿Cuál es el que nos está hablando? ¿Prende?
Sí, no puede. Móvil 4 y...
Hola. Ahí está.
OSS. También. Hola. Ahora sí.
Voy.
Hola. En cualquier momento, el micrófono.
Ahí está.
¿Estamos? Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Bien, me alegro. Esto va a ser la última parte de español que va a haber en todo el resto de la charla, así que disfruten el español, tengan más esto en inglés. Como ustedes sabrán, vienen a escuchar acá a Jared, que va a hablar de Passport.js y básicamente de los aprendizajes que tuvo él al hacer open source. Y la charla en general es una especie de retrospectiva, viendo desde ahora el pasado, todas las cosas que hizo, cuáles hizo bien, cuáles hizo mal, cuáles hizo mejorado, cuáles no, y por qué. Si quieren tuitear algo del evento, el hashtag es OSSBA. Son todas siglas, para que sea más complicado, ¿viste? Entonces, Open Source Software, Buenos Aires. Pues sí. Si es muy fácil, no nos gusta, no es tan divertido. Así que la idea es, primero va a presentar Jared, después yo voy a hacer una o dos preguntas, y después la idea es que todos ustedes puedan hacerle las preguntas que quieran a él. Y después vamos a sortear las remeras, que me imagino que vienen por eso, y por la birra y cerveza, es lo mismo. Por la birra y la pizza que hay después. Así que, sin más preámbulos, los dejo acá con Jared.
Yeah.
Thanks, Linda. Are we good? Volume? Is it loud?
Yeah.
Good? Better? Alright. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the lessons that I've learned developing open source software. I've put out a number of open source projects. Probably most of you would know me from Passport.js. Who here has used it or is aware of it? Okay, good. So somewhat, if you're not aware, Passport is an authentication module for Node.js. This talk is not very technical, so hopefully you can get stuff out of it, even if you're not familiar with that. The first commit I did to Passport was in October 8th of 2011, so roughly 3.5 years ago. Since then, it has almost 5,200 stars on GitHub at this point, and it's downloaded 350,000 times.
Yeah, good.
I don't know.
Right now. Good.
It's green? Yes, right.
It's green, yeah.
Okay.
It's not becoming my place.
Yes. It's working.
I take this off.
Yeah.
All right. Is this better? Good. Okay. It's downloaded 350,000 times per month from NPM now, so it has a lot of usage from both like big enterprises and small companies alike. People tend to like it because it's stable and easy to use and integrate into their application. As I was reflecting back from like the time of the first commit until now,
in making this presentation, I was kind of looking at the evolution of Passport as it has progressed through time and the various phases that it has gone through. Now, I think like software development and how things get built is kind of a mystery, and I'm not like a big fan of people who prescribe processes thing. And as I was making the slide, I was like, oh, this kind of looks like a process type thing. And that's not the old idea that I'm trying to get across here. Rather than a process, this is just sort of, I view software as kind of like a gradual increase in your understanding of the problem, and that's what I'm trying to illustrate with these phases. The analogy that The analogy that I wanted to make was that this is software development is often like if you were in earlier times an explorer before the globe was fully mapped. This is what, like an early map of the world, circa 200 BC from Greece. You can see obviously from our knowledge now, this is very wrong, right? We know that the world looks really nothing like this, although given the technology at the time, it's amazing that they got the Mediterranean roughly as correct as they did. This is really like the prototype phase of software development. From there, you kind of move in to development phases where you're exploring a lot of stuff and learning a lot of stuff about the environment around you. This would be your exploration of the problem you're trying to solve when developing software. This map is 1490, probably one similar to the one Columbus used when he before he sailed to what he thought was going to be India, but was the New World. And then the next iteration of that would, of course, incorporate the knowledge they learned in that process, much like you incorporate knowledge in the software development process. Here you can see you're aware now that North and South America exists. It continues. Columbus made his voyage. Other explorers now want to come to the New World and discover things. And this is much more detailed. Still quite a bit wrong, especially in the more uncharted territories. But it's getting pretty close. And then this would be our understanding of the globe now. We can confidently say that this is pretty stable. We have a stable understanding of what the geography of the world is. So if we take maps like that and translate them into good software maps, this is often the type of stuff you'll see. You'll see an architecture diagram where every piece is nice and square and they stack on top of each other cleanly, and the whole thing is wonderful and perfect. It's comprised of a bunch of little libraries that are themselves square. Of course, nothing in software is perfect, just like the early maps that we had were very imperfect. And a lot of exploratory libraries end up looking something like this. This is quite clearly not stable. It looks like it's going to tip over. If you put something on top of that, it's going to slide right off. But the goal is to go through that process and arrive at what you can confidently say is a stable library. So part of that is the planning phase. And when you're doing open source development, one of the biggest things is you kind of have external motivations for what you want to do. You really have a desire. If you're an explorer, you want to conquer new lands or find riches, I promise you if you do open source, you'll do neither of those things. But it's still important to have a desire. And mine personally were to gain professional recognition was probably the biggest one, and I think that's common with a lot of open source developers. Prior to publishing my own modules, I had used a lot and respected the developers who published them. And I wanted to prove that I could do that as well. Similarly, if you have a successful project, you can gain influence in the community, and that's valuable on a number of occasions. Those are both external motivators. There's internal ones, just the desire to learn new things. Software development, of course, the process technology is changing so fast, and if you can keep up with those things, it's great. And then you can also build your own tools, which is a nice side effect. When I joined Auth0, they are using Passport, and we're doing that before I joined them. So I can join a company and my own tool chain is present already, so I know what the code is. You can't be too selfish, however, in your motivations. Open source is a lot of work. You'll contribute your code freely to the community and not derive a lot of direct financial benefit from that. You also spend a lot of time helping others learn and improve. This is very satisfying, but it also is a lot of work. The other thing you need when planning is solve your own problem. I think if you don't have the problem that you're trying to solve, any attempt to publish an open source module is probably going to fail. DHH, who's famous as the creator of Rails, has a nice succinct statement on this. He says frameworks are extracted, not invented. So basically, you need to have an application that you're going to use your own library in, which is good because then you'll be your own user, which gives you the motivation to continue development, even though you aren't going to see a lot of users in the early days. The other thing to do is research existing solutions. This is incredibly important. Oftentimes, if you're going to start development on a project and you spend some time researching, you'll find a project that already does something pretty close to what you want, and your need is solved without having to spend all the effort. If you, in fact, find that none of the existing solutions are good enough for what you want, this process will teach you a lot that you can incorporate into your own library. You can learn from the good things that other libraries did, as well as the bad things. From there, you can move into the prototyping phase. This, to me, should be very quick. You just want to quickly sketch out the rough functionality that you're trying to accomplish. Here, the point isn't to make it functional or to make it work or to make it perfect, but it's really to discover all those things you don't know. If you have the benefit of history and you look back on this page, you'll find out that everything you did is pretty much wrong or bad, much like those early maps. So expect to make mistakes. Don't overanalyze the problem or write a lot of documentation or a lot of tests. Again, like what comes out of this phase is mostly for your own knowledge, and the code is going to be thrown away largely. So any effort spent on these things is really From there, you really move into the interesting part of the stuff, and that's the development phases. This is where you spend the bulk of the time in the library. In this phase, I think it's really important. All those things that you discovered you didn't know when prototyping, those are the things that you want to learn. When I was doing Passport, I quickly sketched out some authentication stuff, and I realized that the problem was much bigger than I had ever anticipated. There's all sorts of protocols out there that I was unfamiliar with or even totally unaware of. And I learned that as part of the prototyping phase, so I do what I had to research in order to build out functionality. The other thing is to consider the problem from all angles. If you're giving a library that other people are going to use in their application, you really need to put yourself in the other developer's head. And that's important for making a stable API. You need to know how they're going to use your stuff, how that might break, where the weak points are, and you want to get a good sense of that. Once you have that, you should sort of do an iteration where you implement a solution that you think satisfies those constraints, and then repeat the process. And this will happen over and over. As you repeat this process, you're going to discover more things that you know, and then those are the things you want to learn and incorporate into further iterations. As you do that, you'll gain a lot of confidence in your solution, and you want to be increasing test coverage and continuous integration the whole time. One of the things I noticed in Passport, as I progressed further and further through it, the things that I didn't know became less and less, and that's really the sign that your library is starting to stabilize and you're reaching a good final solution. What you don't want to do here is get too attached to what you've done in the past. I think a lot of developers fall into this trap where they'll have spent a lot of time and energy implementing some code, and then someone will suggest something that's different, or they'll encounter something that challenges what they've done in the past, and they'll get kind of angry about it or feel insulted and think that they're wrong. In fact, you're not wrong. This is just part of the process of discovering all those things that you don't know. So take those things into account, like have an open mind and incorporate them into your future iterations. I think one of the patterns that emerged when I was preparing for this talk and looking at the libraries that I've developed is the stage that a project is in is directly proportional to the commit activity on that project. So while the project is in heavy development, you'll see commit activity that's quite frequent and going on constantly with some fairly major changes. If you look at this, that initial thing would be the prototype phase where you committed that code. Then you move on, do some new features, do a few of those, and finally realize that your code's a bit of a mess and do some refactoring. And this will continue for as long as it takes to stabilize your library. And again, this is iterative, and while you're iterating, this shape is constantly changing. If I was like better with graphics, I would make this animated and stuff, but I'm just gonna like flip back and forth. This is really characteristic of the things that will go on in the development cycle as you do things. Things I keep in mind while in the development phase is this. Read this book. Design Patterns is, I think, the key book in teaching us how to build effective libraries. It gives us all kind of a language which we understand, a common language about how to build software and fit various pieces together. As an open source developer, this is especially important because oftentimes you don't have direct lines of communication with the people that use your software. And if you can give them something that they're already familiar with or a pattern that's established, that really helps them integrate your library into an application. The other thing is just do the simplest thing possible. This is pretty cliche at this point, but your whole goal is to drive adoption of your library. Any complications that you add to it will hinder that, so avoid them if you can. Also, invent as little as possible. And this is something I try very hard to do, but I feel it's a trap that people can fall into. Oftentimes, there's a lot of really interesting advances that are good and should be adopted, but they're not because they did too much. If you're going to introduce something new to someone, they're going to need to understand that new thing and find a way to integrate it into their own application. So anything that's too new or causes them to learn too much, it's going to be a barrier to entry. So stick only with like a core idea, and anytime that you need something, find something that exists when new. When you're in the development process, get feedback. And I think this should be done as soon as possible. Don't wait for getting feedback. Time will never be just right. A lot of engineers look at the software and know all the imperfections in it, and they say, okay, I'm not going to tell anyone about this until it's perfect. Of course, it's never going to be perfect, and if you don't get feedback as soon as possible, people are going to be unaware of your library if that exists. For getting feedback, the usual channels are good. Hacker News is good. Reddit, and specifically the subreddits, go to the programming language community for the language that you use and post about your library there. Also just tweet about it and get your friends to retweet. This is good kind of for a PR thing to make people aware that your library exists, but it can also be overrated. I don't find that many people sort of adopt the libraries that I make if they found about them on these channels. So just keep that in mind. Apart from announcements, to really drive adoption of your library, the biggest thing is to help others succeed with it. I think this is pretty typical of any software or company that is successful, is they spend a lot of time on support. When I first started Passport and in the initial stages, I spent a lot of time on Stack Overflow answering questions that people had regarding authentication, and specifically authentication in Node.js apps. So I go to their Stack Overflow question, I would tell them how to solve their problems using Passport, and then in turn they'd see, okay, they've incorporated that into their application in order to answer the questions and move forward. I would also be pretty active on Twitter. I would search Passport.js every day, and if anyone said that they had adopted Passport or used it, I would reply and thank them for doing it. And if they had any questions, feel free to email me. And this paid off huge dividends because I think those initial early adopters, they were so satisfied that I was helping them out. They told their friends, and in turn they knew the solutions to the common problems so they could help their friends out. IRC is another one. I'm not a big user of IRC, but a lot of people derive a lot of benefit from that for support channels. The website is another really big deal in promoting your project and getting adoption. I think for maybe the first 3 or 4 months of Passport being reasonably usable, all it had was a GitHub readme. And that's fine for a lot of like smaller modules that don't have a lot of functionality, but for something that has a bigger ecosystem around it, it's really great to have a website. And there's a couple things that I think were pretty instrumental in the website being successful. One, I kind of had a short tagline to describe the project, and that's simple, unintrusive authentication for Node.js. People would go to the website, and that in just a sentence, in a split second, they know if this is something that they can use or not. The other thing I found really interesting is when people would just tweet out the link to Passport.js, they would just copy this tagline and tweet. So for really no effort, I sort of get to control the brand, if you will, of the library just by having a tagline that people can use. And of course, documentation is the main point of the website. Having a step-by-step tutorial to get people up and running is important, and extensive documentation for anything that goes beyond that. The website itself is really the thing that most people go to. It gets about 60,000 visits per month from 32,000 people at this point. Search accounts for 75% of those visits, so that's mostly documentation. People will search a specific problem and land at the documentation that describes how to solve that problem. Social sites, surprisingly, only account for about 5% of visits, which is why I say they're mostly overrated in terms of spending time on them. Stack Overflow is the exception to that because most of social and also just a good form for providing support. One of the other interesting aspects of this is that 32,000 people that visit is roughly stable, even though the usage of the library itself is increasing, which to me suggests that most people only go to the website when they're first learning about the library, and then once they're familiar with it, they don't typically come back. So gear the website mostly to new users. If you driven adoption, now you have a bunch of people using your library, and you run into this problem. Of course, you need to provide a migration path. Because of the shape of the library is constantly shifting as you continue development on it, you're going to have users who are using features that you want to either change or remove from the library. As a library developer, this problem is actually relatively easy. Just use semantic version, and that's all you have to do. If you implement your major version on any breaking changes, that's the way to communicate to the user that those things have happened. And then just give them notes on how to migrate. And they can migrate on their own time. You can proceed on new development and features, and they can migrate a year later if they want to, if that's their own development timeline. Those timelines don't have to be coupled together. So after all this, we're in the development phase. We have this library that's roughly functional, and hopefully has some users at this point. But we have this goal of moving it to this nice, good, stable library with clean interfaces. So this is where I think a lot of people get stuck. We're in this development cycle that's constantly churning, but to get to stable, we need to find a way to break out of that. And this is really, I think, the goal of good software development, but also something that a lot of software never achieves. And I think, to me, the way to break that cycle is to break the development down into kind of two things. One is like the functional development, and finally the refined sort of development. And functional is where you really add a lot of features and do change the interfaces in the library. Refined is where you really whittle it down to something stable. And this comment was making its way on Twitter a few weeks ago. I find it pretty funny. This is really about addressing the technical debt that you accumulated, which can be hard, and oftentimes people don't want to get around wheels. So development in this refined stage is really about taking this. All these rough edges that you see here, that's what you really want to identify. And to me, these are just candidates for separate libraries. And this is what I did with Passport, breaking it out into separate strategies, if you're familiar with that, how that works, and some other libraries that kind of came out of the process. And by sort of like identifying those rough edges and whittling them down, that refinement process will eventually result in the square library that you want as a good software designer. So this is my rule on software, is that stable software results from breaking parts into successively smaller pieces until each piece has a clean, proven interface. And that's really how I go about development. And once that proven interface is there, that's when I consider software stable. So when you're refining, this is typically the phase where you kind of slow things down. There should be less changes going on. What you're really doing is studying what you've done and where you've been in the past, and really filling in all the details of it and removing anything that's extraneous. And at the end of this process, you should be a complete expert on the problem that you're trying to solve. When I first started developing Passport, I was roughly familiar with authentication, but by no means an expert. But over the course of that process, I really learn in depth a lot of what goes into authentication and feel pretty confident to speak on most of those topics. So that refinement phase is basically how we break this cycle and move our library to a stable phase. This quote I like: perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And that's what I try to achieve in stabilizing software. Once we're there, what does stable mean? Well, going back to the design patterns book that I brought up previously, this is what you should try to achieve in API design. Allow people to program to an interface rather than an implementation. What does that mean? In terms of a stable library, that square, the boundary of that, that's the interface, that's the API that developers are going to use. All the stuff inside is just implementation details that they don't need to be aware of. In Passport's case, that looks like passport.authenticate for web apps authenticate users, and passport.use where people can plug in authentication strategies, typically implemented by people more familiar with the security aspects. And that allows this sort of nice layering of architecture where the user directory will underpin all this stuff, Passport core module will be there, some strategies will be plugged in alongside of it, and then the application can be built on top. When you're in the stable phase, what you should do is just have complete confidence in the implementation you arrived at. You shouldn't look at it and say, oh, there's some rough parts and things I don't really like. By the time you stabilize, you should be confident in that. I also like to have 100% test coverage on anything I consider stable. To me, that's just my way of saving myself time. If there's bug fixes I need to go back and maintain to know that I haven't broken anything. It's also a confidence boost to the people who use your library that it does have that much coverage. The other thing is I have pretty comprehensive comments on any, like if you read the Passport source code, it details a lot of what I'm trying to achieve as well as kind of my thinking that went into making that. This is good for both me if I go back and have to work on the code, or other developers who want to understand how that works in their own application. And then finally, just put this thing in maintenance mode, which basically means your final refinements will trail off most of the commits, and then from there you'll have very little commits over time. If you look at Passport, I commit very rarely at this point. I've gone months without making commits to it. Stable libraries should look like that, in my opinion. However, this is one of my pet peeves of open source development, is that there are people out there, when they see that a library has not had commits for 6 months, who feel the need to file a GitHub issue to ask me if the project is still maintained, which sometimes I just sarcastically answer yes, and close the issue without further comment. To me, this, I think people should view the infrequency of commits as a very good thing and encourage it. The one sort of slight caveat on that is sometimes you'll have a library that you consider stable, but it'll have an external dependency that you don't control. I run into this problem a lot with the Passport strategies because they call APIs of third-party authentication services. And those APIs change without my control. For instance, Google's doing a lot of refactoring to their authentication endpoints, deprecating OpenID and various other things. And that often breaks code that I would otherwise consider stable and can't control it. The problem with this is that that happens when you don't want it to and you don't have time to do it. And so this, when I joined Auth0 about a month ago, this is an example of their package.json, which I found kind of funny. They have a bunch of forks of all these Passport strategies that I originally developed, and now that they've fixed them for all these breaking changes on providers. To me, when I see this, I actually quite like this, even though some people don't. To me, Git forks are a good thing, right? It used to be that people kind of fear a project forking. To me, that doesn't have to be the case anymore. If you use an open source module and it's not accounting for these changes, you can just fork it, patch it yourself, and the progress can happen on independent timelines, right? Auth0 was able to patch all these things without bothering me about it, which I appreciate. And now I'm sure I'll have to fix. The other thing that's really interesting about stable libraries is that your commit activity drops over time, but the usage and support will increase. I think, like, if you're running a business, this is great because this is the point you just ramp up and make a ton of money. If you're doing open source development, it's not so great because you have a bunch of people asking you support questions and you don't have time to deal with it. So to me, and this is part of the process that I'm still figuring out, is I'm trying to engineer myself out a lot of the process. I like to do the development, but I don't like to do the support. And the development is fairly maintainable at this point. And that's interesting because I think the support requests at this point, when I get them in my email, I just tell the people to go ask the same question on Stack Overflow. And if I have time and see their question and it's unanswered, I will answer it or try to. But oftentimes what I find out is that there are a lot of other people now answering questions about Passport. So it's really great that the community can step up and deal with some of those issues. So what are my lessons learned after all of this? The first one is have strong opinions weakly held. I think this is just a good lesson in life. You want to know what you're trying to do, but you also want to be receptive to feedback about it. Don't get bogged down in thinking about writing through that. Another good one on software is there are no technical problems, only people problems. I think this is very true in open source development. You'll see a lot of people, most people are great and have good intentions, but there's some people who want to start discussions and just get thrown into a debate that goes nowhere. Find a way to deal with that without being unproductive. Developer ease of use, this is a big one. I think the biggest thing I learned from Passport is that results from clean APIs and good documentation. One of the reasons Passport is so successful is that its API is very simple and relatively easy to understand. It has good documentation that people can use to get up and running. Scale with adoption. Again, this is the challenge that I'm currently facing. You need to find a way to maintain your project and scale as its usage increases. Some of the things that help with that are build a community. This is one of the things the website has been good at, and Stack Overflow as well. People feel like they use Passport when they're invested in it and want to help it. Automate everything, of course. All the tests that you do, you don't want to make any mistakes by doing things manually. Popularity drives popularity. Open source is much like high school in this respect. If you have a popular project, it's just going to get naturally more popular on your own, on its own. Also, if you have some visibility in the community, you can do new projects and people tend to notice them faster than you would otherwise. Also, timing and luck matter. I think the fact that Passport is as popular as it is not because of anything that I did, but just rather the time in which I started it, which was when Node.js was relatively young and didn't have any good authentication frameworks already that people were used to. So I was able to take advantage of that moment in time and build something that addressed that need, and then people adopted it and took off on its own. And finally, just have fun. There's a lot of work involved in open source. Some of it's going to feel like a chore, but never get to the point where you're not having fun with it. That's it.
Thank you, Jared. I just have like 2 questions, so then the rest of people can ask. The first one is, so you said that when you were building an open source project, it's basically because it was driven by something that you needed to be done. Yeah. But then you have like tons and tons of different Passport strategies. Did you really use all of them?
Well, okay, so no, I didn't. That would be different motivation. So when I first started Passport, there was another project called EveryOff that existed, which I personally didn't like that much, although it had a number of things implemented already. And so all the strategies that I built were just to get to parity with EveryOff, so that I didn't want to have anyone to have a reason to use an inferior solution. So that's basically my like ego and wanting to win.
Have you had any other competition?
There's other stuff out there that's more kind of front-end focused, I've noticed, and some people have asked me about how that integrates with the back-end. I haven't seen any. There are some other authentication frameworks that are out there. One is called I forget what the name is, but nothing serious.
And now that you have finished the project, if you were to go back in time, would you have done anything differently?
No, I think the way it turned out, that's maybe the one piece of software that I still point at and say, I did things right on that, which is pretty rare in software. Usually end up Passport has been great.
And the last question is like, when did you figure out that it was going to be like huge and used by everyone? What was like the tipping point for you?
The tipping point was actually like fairly early. I think like since I was solving my own problem, like I recognized that this is great. Like I had that sense that I hit on something that was much simpler than anything that existed before. And at that point, I thought it could be successful, and that's really what motivated me to like provide all the support and really build it up, right? Because I thought I had that.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah.
So,
No.
Yes. ¿Cuánto tiempo le subió al principio? ¿Cuánto tiempo laboral? ¿Cuánto tiempo libre? ¿Y por qué no te...
Okay. So the first question is like, in the beginning, how much time did it consume you? Like, was it like work time? Was it like your free time? Or how did it work?
yeah, so like Passport was mostly a personal project. I wasn't doing it for like a company or a job or anything at that point. It was just my own programming on the side. And Passport itself, like the core of it and that initial development was probably about like 2 weeks of like nighttime work, which is about it. And then after that, there was a lot of maintenance and some of the strategies, more bugs than others, but 2 weeks really.
And the second question we had was like, why didn't you do TDD?
But, well, I guess I feel like doing too much testing up front, like, kind of goes back to the math analogy. Like, I know that I always do things wrong initially, and anything I do there is just going to be, you're kind of testing like an architecture that you're not sure about, right? And I like to be a little bit more sure that the architecture is not going to be changing before I invest a lot of time in tests. That's, there's degrees to that, but that's just my own personal.
Not a question, but an observation. You had one slide that said how to drive adoption, and I had experience with many interactions with lots of products. I don't have one big product, but I have many different business projects. One way to do that and drive adoption is to implement some things that those projects need, and you can provide them. For example, you search for one project that doesn't have application there, and make it fast.
I would say that's also a good one. I didn't think to put that in the slides, but now there's what's called the mean stack. I don't know if anyone here knows with that stuff, and they actually. The question was basically to drive adoption, you can implement something that other projects need in their own stuff, right? So that's a good point. My example being the mean stack, which now like includes Passport as part of its stuff. And a lot of people find Passport through going to the mean stack, which is drives Passport adoption. Of course, I think that's interesting. In terms of like Passport's own development, it started before a lot of these other projects. So I'm not, there's kind of a chicken and the egg on that one, but it's definitely true.
Another one, but what was your building when you started the Passport?
What was my what?
What was your building that you need to stop and start the
Oh, well, I mean, the question was, what was I building when I started doing Passport? And the answer was really nothing serious. I think I was probably like trying to build an app to automate like some Philips Hue lights to change colors or something like that. Really stupid, like personal things for my house, right? So that thing is basically gone in Passport.
Stupid things, right?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah. I mean, the point is like I had a need for it. It was a pretty trivial need, but it's still, you need to have your own reasons.
You talk about exposure, motivations. You talk about being selfish. I would like to know what kind of benefits do you get? Maybe by getting the exposure, not that you were looking for them, but you get them personal and maybe as a startup, Node.js.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Like when I first started doing Passport, like having some more exposure in the community was, I thought, a really important thing. Like I kind of wanted to build something that people were aware of, and then maybe I get to talk at things more often and stuff like that. In fact, like in the 3.5 years, this week I've done 2 talks, and those are the first talks I've ever done about open source development. So I guess like, it was selfish in that I wanted to prove I could do it, but once I proved that I could do it, I really didn't care about those things anymore. I would say like the one benefit that I do get from it is that a lot of people contact me, and like I live in the Bay Area, obviously, so there's a lot of developers there, and they'll just email me and say, hey, like I use Passport, we love it, I'd love to get dinner or take you to coffee or something like that. So I'll meet with these people and you know, kind of have a bigger network. Because of it, I met Matthias and the guys at Cloud Zero basically because they use Passport, and now of course I work there, so it's easier to get jobs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I wanted to know if the commit graph could still apply to really big open source projects. Say the Nike Star, for example, we still think that the numbers of commit should decrease in time.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger the application, right, the harder that is to make happen because it's just more complex, right? And that's where my point comes in about like breaking those things in smaller pieces, which is relatively easy to do in the Node community just because the package manager is so good. But I think it's not necessarily the commits that make up the application as a whole that need to decrease, but just the individual pieces as they stabilize. There's always going to be that layer on top, the new feature that's going to be experimental.
Let's say the number of new lines, not maybe commits.
Yeah.
The second question was, suppose that you want to start from tomorrow, you want to live in the Bahamas and play Pong all the time. Could the Passport will still maintain?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I do most of the development. There's plenty of people out there who could perfectly well maintain that code, I guess. Yeah.
There are any forks?
Oh, I mean, there's a bunch of forks on GitHub. I mean, people fork it to patch it, or I don't know why some people fork it because there will be forks and then people never do anything with it. I think there's about like 340 forks, I think, which is actually, I mean, you'd be surprised, but there's an interesting, well, I think it's interesting. I kind of wonder if there's a relation between the number of stars on GitHub and the number of forks. And basically, if that is less, the project is better than if that is more, if that makes sense. One of the things when I was starting this and then competing with EveryOff, like there were a lot of forks to star ratio, right? There might have been, I think, let's say 300 stars and 200 forks, which to me was an indication that like, all the people who liked it, most of them had a reason to change it, right? And Passport is now like 5,000 stars to 300 forks, so if you do the division, I don't know, but it's relatively low percentage, right?
But there may be a relation between number of forks and number of pull requests. That's a good indication.
That is good. I mean, I think this is part of where I get sort of the question being there's a relation between number of forks and number of pull requests, which is definitely true. I think this is maybe where I've gotten a little bit lazy, is that I'm definitely behind on a lot of pull requests. Like, I don't know that all of them should be merged. Most of the pull requests I get at this point, I don't think deserve being merged. But certainly there are some that should be, and I'm just kind of behind on that. And that's part of, to me, stabilizing the library, right? Like, I put it into a stable mode because I don't think it needs a lot of maintenance. And then again, like the people who need a feature, their answer to that is important, which is exactly what Auth0 did with all strategies, right? So I don't think someone should be negatively impacted because I'm personally slow on version pull requests.
Are there any courses to other platforms that you're aware of?
Passport? There's been one in Go that took a lot of the ideas in Passport and basically made them work in Go, and I think maybe a couple of other languages too. I don't follow them too closely because I don't work in those languages. No, I don't really, no. It's enough work on its own. I don't think it's more.
A couple of days ago, yesterday, I saw a tweet about the passport running with React Native.
Mm-hmm.
It's only for native or?
Oh, no. So, yeah, so the question is, you saw a tweet about Passport working with React Native. Yeah, and so I'm not a front-end expert, but React Native is, I think, a front-end framework. Is that right? Yeah.
iOS.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Passport is entirely like a back-end implementation. It runs on the server side with Node.js. So any front-end integrations, those are just integrations to make it easier to work with Passport in that framework. I've looked at some of them, and I don't have a lot of familiarity with them. But Passport doesn't require that. It works on any server side.
There's a question that someone made on Twitter that says how to manage the negativity and the bad feedback. Common comment like that is not going to work, it's crap, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so the best thing to do really about that is to be like professional about it. There's a number of people who open issues thinking that they found some problem that they perceive with it. And oftentimes, I'll just basically ask them to explain their stance a little bit more, and then explain my stance, and hopefully that's a productive discussion. There are cases in which that's not productive, in which I just kind of politely say, like, I made my point clear, good luck with whatever you want to do for your solution. Just kind of, we can part ways.
Are you still actively answering the issues on GitHub?
Not as much. I do try to actively answer, but there are enough that I qualify very quickly. But whenever I have time, I try to. Right now.
Besides, this was the variant from the previous question about the benefits of having built JS and developing. Did it bring you any? It's more of a personal question, but any economic benefits? What kind of them?
No, not really. It's probably.
How do you make a living, but
Yeah. No, the question was, does it bring me any economic benefits? And no, I mean, it's probably negative, right? I spend a lot of time doing it that I don't get paid for. I think I get 26 cents per week on a gift tip. So, yeah.
like you make contracts with people who use them and maybe you got customers for it.
Well, so I think there's probably a definite possibility that if I wanted to do consulting around it, I could make that work. I personally don't enjoy that type of work, so I don't pursue that. Oswero hired me recently. That'd be like the biggest economic impact of that work itself. Right?
Maybe you're just missing the PayPal name badge. That's all it is.
Yeah.
Yes, do you recommend to split your project? Imagine that you take that little library or little part of your project, emerge as an independent API, but not so independent. I mean, it has no use beyond your project. Do you recommend to split another project, or do you prefer to keep?
I think it probably depends on the exact situation. Like the Passport strategies themselves are a result of this, right? So when I was first doing it, I didn't have any strategy, but like Twitter and Facebook were basically built into the same code base, right? And then I decided that those are probably going to evolve on their own, so I split them out. It's kind of a maintenance thing where I can easily stabilize the core, but probably can't necessarily stabilize all these results. So cases like plugins that go into a framework but aren't useful without the framework, I think are good candidates for separating out. If it's not sort of a plugin style interface, then maybe not.
So now we have t-shirts, but unfortunately there's more people asking questions than the t-shirts we have. So we can try something if you're up to it. If you want to ask a question and the one who answers gets the t-shirt, it's improvising.
You can ask the question.
But you made Passport, dude, I didn't.
I've given my talk.
Okay, let's try something different. First one that puts their hands up. 1, 2.
Rara concurrencia, boludo.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think I have the strength to do it. Let's try it out.
No me dice lo estadio.
Okay.
Vamos a decirle, ahora vamos a hacer más pizzas en 5 minutos y es cerveza.
Okay. Lo que dijo él. Ahora hay pizza y cerveza.
Chao.
I just know this slide share or something.
Yeah, yeah.
El micrófono, que va. Sí, sí.